Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan, and as always, we have a very interesting guest. With me today is Curtis Fox. Curtis is a former Green Beret and a graduate of Georgetown. Today, he works as a program manager, and he wrote a very interesting book on hybrid warfare, which we will go into later on. Curtis, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you very much for being here. It's a real pleasure. I'm a frequent reader of Great Dynamics, and I'm very excited to be able to participate. I need to front load and say that all opinions are my own and do not reflect the policy of the Department of Defense or the United States government, but I'm real glad I can be here.
Perfect. As I said to you before, we've had people on before that had to give a disclaimer, so that's no problem. We will also put it in the show notes. So, Curtis, how did your journey start in the U.S. military, and what was that like?
It started with the subprime mortgage crisis, if you could believe that. I was finishing up my bachelor's at Virginia Tech in mechanical engineering, and I started on a research assistantship to, pay for my graduate program. And right in the middle of my first summer in doing research, the principals had to bring me in, and they said, hey, look, all the funding and the outside support we had for the project had disappeared. There were a number of businesses that were supporting the research, and they decided that they didn't want to release any more grant money because they had other things they needed to spend it on. And so I went from, having my rent paid and my way through graduate school paid to starting to deliver pizzas. And I was trying to figure out what was going to come next. And, I had the conversation with myself, where I said, hey, look, when I'm, 45 or 50 years old, I'm going to look back and wish I had done some time in service. And so I looked at the Army as a method of, paying for my master's degree. And we had a friend of the family who had actually gone into Special Forces. And he made a point to sit down with me and just tell me about his experience. And there was a little more nuance to being a Green Beret than just, the gunfighting aspect that soft units are so frequently associated with. There's a foreign language component and a need to work by, with, and through indigenous partners. And it's actually the Special Forces ODAs are the only units in all of the United States military that actually run their own op cycle internally. They're the only units that are capable of gathering the information in their environment, putting together their own mission package, actually conducting the mission, and then being able to gather information in the aftermath. And that kind of independence and autonomy was really interesting to me, and the need to work in a unit that needs only individuals that can function in a disconnected environment was very appealing. And, the experience in the Army didn't disappoint. I enlisted, you go through basic training, there's a preparatory course, and then if you're selected, you go through the Special Forces training pipeline. But if at any point you fail out in that cycle, you go to the needs of the Army. And that was a special program that was stood up for the war on terror. But it worked out very well for me.
And what was that experience like? And when you passed selection, and did you know into what group you're going to go beforehand, or?
No, I didn't. They tell you your assignments, at least at the time, they told you your assignments once you finish the pipeline. The language that you learn has a strong bearing on which group you're going to get associated with. Though needless to say, every group needs somebody that probably speaks Arabic, but my assigned language was Russian, and that made 10th Special Forces Group my very likely assignment point. Yeah, it was a harrowing process, but you learn a lot about yourself.
I can imagine. And since the 10th is specialized in Europe, or that's its area of operations, did you get any experience in the war on terror, or was it purely focused on like European landscape?
No, it was not actually. The way the war on terror was working at the time was that almost every Special Forces group had shared responsibilities for Afghanistan. Although there was one primary group that was putting in personnel at any, given time, and those focuses would be handed off as needed. 10th Group was covering down on large portions of Africa at the time. And so actually, a few of my deployments were to Africa. And that was the war on terror missions we did.
Can you go into a little bit of your experience and how it was working with host nation partners and as a young man?
I can tell you it was eye-opening to see how other people live. There's a lot of Americans that have never spent a summer without air conditioning, and to be in parts of the world where there's extreme poverty and still institutions like slavery was very eye-opening. One of the things that stick out to me was the way in which the locals in Africa treat hospitality. It's almost their own sense of pride, and they have an extreme sense of the need to show you that they're good people and they're people worth knowing by being hospitable to you. And that applies to everybody from the local gas station clerk, to the cab driver, all the way up to the colonel in the Ministry of Defense that you're interfacing with. And that it was a really interesting aspect.
I mean, we talked a little bit about it before, about being in Somalia and a place that both of us worked. So can you, without going too much into detail, tell how that experience was?
I think one of the most interesting things about that experience, I'm trying to remember if my timeline is correct here, the Somali national government in its current form was only reestablished in maybe 2012. And so it was only a few years old when I was in country, and they're still very much getting a sense of themselves. And it's a government that's funded largely by international partners. But nevertheless, there are people in Somalia that clearly see the need for this. They understand, the benefits of, let's say, nation statehood. They understand that the status quo in Somalia, particularly with Al-Shabaab, it's not tenable, and no one wants to live that way. And they are willing to fight for it, and a lot of people are willing to die for it. The thing that governments like Somalia really have to push through and persevere through are, let's say, maybe the family-oriented and tribal-oriented nature of the peoples there. It's an aspect of the culture. They're always going to be, let's say, more committed to their family and their immediate family, their extended family and their tribe than they are to the national government. And that's going to be a long process of, let's say, untangling before everyone is committed, in the same level to this nation state. And an enormous part of that process is the government, let's say the Somali national government out of Mogadishu, demonstrating in clear and understandable terms that working with them is better, and will be better for them and better for their tribe and better for their family in the long run than potentially letting an insurgency like Al-Shabaab gain, let's say, real political authority. And that's a long teething process, and I got to see parts of it. And one of the things that really has stuck out to me, not just while I was there, but in the years after and watching Somalia, was that Al-Shabaab has tried to make the move into a political movement at a number of levels, and they keep failing. And it seems clear to me that they're unable to really convey to the population as a whole of what the benefits of their rule are. Certainly not, and certainly not in a way that would be sustainable across the country. Maybe there's some sort of a caliphate they could eventually establish in southern Somalia if they eventually, made enough military gains. But I don't see them ever being able to establish a stable rule. The problem is, how long is it going to take the Somali national government to explain their counter thesis, let's say.
Not to go too deep into the weeds here, but there's one question or a comment that I hear often, which is, what will happen if the African Union mission leaves, and will Somalia go in the same way as Afghanistan? And I think it's apples and oranges. The two countries are extremely different. In some ways, they are very similar when you look at like tribal makeup and these type of things. Can you give your opinion on that?
Yeah, I guess the first piece to say is that I think the surrounding countries, around Somalia have a much more they have a much greater understanding of what their stake is in the long-term outcome of Somalia than any of the regional partners did around Afghanistan. And I think that dictates the nature of the African Union participation in the conflict. Kenya, Ethiopia especially, they're acutely aware of what the consequences for them would be if al-Shabaab were to gain a permanent political presence in Somalia. And they don't want that in any sense. And so even if they'll say the African Union as an institution were to remove itself, I'm quite certain that the Kenyans and the Ethiopians would be motivated to intervene, and there will always be some sort of an external presence. And this is very different from, let's say, the Taliban in Afghanistan, because most of the regional partners they might not have wanted the Taliban to come back to power, but they weren't really willing to interfere to stop it from happening. And the Taliban had sanctuary in Pakistan, and not just sanctuary, but the ISI, was willing. The Pakistani, the intelligence service, was supporting them, supplying them, and providing their senior leaders with safe harbor. And that's going to, that's part of the Pakistani national defense strategy, is to use insurgencies to pursue foreign policy objectives. There's no such occasion with al-Shabaab. They do have support from international terrorist organizations in the form of al-Qaeda, let's say, but that support, it's let's say it's financial in nature primarily, and then they provide armament. It has the paradox of being foreign fighters that are, let's say, of Arab descent, trying to come into a region that's not primarily ethnically Arab, and it creates a scene that's difficult for them because they stick out as outsiders. Under the let's to say the framework of Salafist Islam provides them a moral framework of cooperation, and that's how al-Shabaab kind of moves forward as an institution. But it makes it very difficult for them to establish real rapport with the public. And that's a paradox that al-Shabaab has not been able to fix in their approach.
No, absolutely. I think it made efforts to focus on a Somali message and focus on that. And they have in the past also cleared out international or Afghani or Arab fighters, which I don't think really exist anymore within al-Shabaab. If we zoom out away from Somalia and we look at Africa, and it's, I think, something you can talk about a little bit more, is the shift, and particularly in the Sahel, away from France, not necessarily I think from the US, and the adoption of Russian influence and aid through Wagner and Russia Africa Corps and these types of entities. Your book talks about hybrid warfare, and I think that's a nice little segue there. Could you give your opinion or your views on that shift, and how does that fit into the larger methodology of how Russia sees its foreign policy as well as its warfare?
Yeah, great question. And to fully answer it, I think I would have to start by critiquing French colonialism. And it's very different from, we tend to, in the West especially, we tend to think of all colonial empires being managed in the same way. And for the most part, that's not true. The Turkish Empire was, they were absolutely brutal occupiers. And, the crimes against humanity that they committed, they actually, they kind of go overlooked by Western observers in a lot of senses. But even if you look at like the British and the French, there's enormous differences in governance. The Brits had a method of engaging with the world where they understood in the colonies that they invested that they had to actually serve some purpose for the rest of the British Empire. And so they looked at the geographies that have, let's say, clear, functional, safe harbors and ports where they could invest in infrastructure and it would really yield fruit. in places they looked for populations that were very willing to work with them and integrate themselves into the larger ecosystem of the British Empire. And so, British investments in that sense are almost driven almost exclusively by commerce. Alternatively, the French had a philosophy of make the world France, where the British colonial governors basically established English common law for the Anglos living in those countries, while they would let the local leadership, whether that's tribal or whether they had actually established a degree of political governance that we could recognize under some unified ruler and leadership, some monarchy. As long as they understood they were subject to the crown, they were basically able to govern themselves according to their own tradition. And that makes for a much quieter empire, makes for better business. For the French, they adopted the attitude that you were going to be French, you were going to learn French, and you were going to act French, and you're going to understand that all roads lead to Paris. And they don't invest, in, let's say, places that are nearly as functional as the British do. And that's one of the reasons all of these former French colonies in the Sahel, you might wonder what it was that those countries were offering, France as colonial possessions 200 years ago when they're, located out in, the middle of the Sahel. And the answer is not much, but that wasn't the point. The point was that France is great and they should be French. Well, if you play that forward, 200 years, they have real resentments against Paris, and it doesn't take much to really, fan the flames of those resentments for them to really, come up to the top. And that's kind of what Wagner has done. And they don't really have to lie in order to bring up
True.
legitimate resentments. But they have. And certainly from World War II forward, the French have, their grip on these colonies has been, let's say, strained. But it's very easy to find a local politician that needs a big bag of money. It's very easy to find a local politician. If he won't work with you, if he's incorruptible, he might accidentally get a toaster thrown into the bathtub with him when he's, taking a bath. And that, those people tend to have accidents. And the French they don't have the same scruples that let's say that the Anglosphere does. And it becomes a little bit more pointed in the modern context, especially in the post-Soviet context, because the French are realizing, especially maybe from the subprime mortgage crisis or maybe the Trump administration forward, that they do have real economic interests in some of these former colonies. There are natural resources there that they need to feed their economy. And so maintaining those political relationships are vital, and they're looking to their old colonial trade network to feed themselves. So these successes done by Wagner, I think the French will find a way to reestablish a foothold. And part of the reason for that is that long-term, I don't think any sort of relationship with Wagner will deliver a better outcome for the people of, Mali, for example. But in the near term, Wagner operates under this Russian framework that Vladimir Putin's done a very good job of articulating, which is that Russia believes firmly that the internal issues of any foreign country, in any country in the world, is strictly their business. Moscow wants to do business with you, they want to trade with you, but they don't exist to tell you what your internal politics should be. And that's a very potent lure to a despotic regime that sees reform as too politically costly. And alternatively, if you wanted to have a relationship with Europe or you wanted to have a relationship with the United States, they might go so far as to demand that you have elections and that you establish something akin to rule of law, and that you not arrest members of the political opposition. That is for a junta running an African government, that can be a bridge too far. And Wagner is a very appealing short-term solution. So the final piece I would add to that is that what Wagner is interested in is strictly profit in these countries. I don't think we should have any illusions that they're helping these juntas build, let's say, a stable series of institutions that function and actually promoting that country's national interests. They're willing to provide security services for the government, let's say protection for officials so that they know they're not going to be subject to a coup of some kind or an assassination of some kind. But their primary interest is in providing security services to diamond mines, oil, natural gas repositories, any commodity that can be extracted and then, either sent to Russia to feed their system or maybe repackaged and re-exported. Oil arbitrage is a very popular strategy, but they also do basic training services for the military. They'll establish the country as a client state, issue them a series of loans, and then that country can use those loans to buy Russian military hardware, something they did with Venezuela. And so there's a lot of lucrative opportunities here. It's one of the reasons after the Wagner insurrection and, that mad dash to Moscow, it's one of the reasons that Wagner didn't immediately disappear as a private military company is because they're useful. And, how would Moscow be able to do these things without them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is of interest to say that after the death of Prigozhin, that Wagner in some places, not in all, but in some places have been pushed out by GRU or other like private entities, but the job itself remains the same. Obviously, it's not even though Wagner serves as to get money in, but it is a extension of the Russian state.
That's a very good way to conceptualize it.
So if we then look at Ukraine, your book mainly talks about, I'll just quickly say the title, Hybrid Warfare, the Russian Approach to Strategic Competition and Conventional Military Conflict. We look at Ukraine, where I think Georgia was the first time where they employed some of these hybrid tactics. Can you tell us, I think in an easy to understand way, what is hybrid warfare, and particularly what is hybrid warfare for Russians, and when did that strategy come to be?
Let me start with the strategic picture because it answers your last question first, and I'll work down to the tactical. So when we think of hybrid warfare, we have to start with Russian grand strategy, and it's a grand strategy that has not evolved significantly since Peter the Great. I mean, this predates Vladimir Lenin by many hundreds of years. You could even go back to maybe the 8th century and the actual emergence of the Rus ethnicity itself and carry that forward. They're located on that vast northern Eurasian steppe, and there are no geographic barriers. So, as an ethnicity, the only way to really achieve a degree of security was simply to expand. And when you run into other ethnicities, the only strategy that you can really execute to deal with them is to either conquer them and make them subordinate and ultimately subsume them into your ranks, or to eradicate them or drive them out. And that the Rus ethnicity has been expanding across that plain since their emergence. What Peter the Great really did, he achieved a number of extraordinary things, including building the first real Russian Navy. But what he was able to really articulate into their grand strategy was an expansion until Russia could anchor its political boundaries against hard geographic barriers. That would be the Black Sea, the Carpathian Mountains, the Baltic Sea, the Arctic Ocean, the Caucasus Mountains in the south, or the Gobi Desert. And that is the reason Russia expanded to be the world's largest country. So at the strategic level, that's the grand strategy they're pursuing, and their hybrid warfare methodology is a means of achieving those objectives. One of the things the Russians have always known is that they exist on the periphery of Europe. They're not a part of European political progress or even technological development for the most part. And because of that, it's very difficult for them to compete directly with a country like Germany or France or, what have you. And so their approach to let's say political competition has always been to kind of throw monkey wrenches in between the machinations of the European great powers. They look for fissures and divides within the European political system where they can push in a pry bar and try to keep these grand coalitions from forming, the kind of coalitions like under Napoleon or maybe Adolf Hitler that were capable of actually marching eastward and threatening Russia. And that's always been their strategy. As a component of that strategy, as far as they look for internal security, they've always relied on a potent, let's say, secret service or secret police that can find political dissidents and arrest them. Because it's easier to eliminate agitators than it is to march an army from a place like St. Petersburg all the way out to Kamchatka to stop a local insurrection. That's how they hold the country together. And for the most part, that strategy has played out for them. Joseph Stalin really achieved the apogee of that strategy in the aftermath of World War II. He conquered most of Eastern Europe and installed authoritarian socialist regimes that were meant to be buffer states between Russia and the West. And the end state was to forward stage Russian heavy ground forces with tactical nuclear ordnance in East Germany on the other side of the Fulda Gap. And that is what the Russians define as security. That's where they stop being nervous. So if we look at hybrid warfare from the operational level, let's say the Russians have an emerging crisis in, let's say, a place like Ukraine or, the Crimean Peninsula or maybe Georgia. What hybrid warfare is it's a whole of government approach to try to resolve the crisis on terms that favor Moscow. So when we talk about a whole government approach, that means first off, there's a military component, and that kinetic military component needs to be potent. But first off, it's not the first preferred approach. We would prefer to use non-military and non-kinetic influences in order to achieve our means before we resort to military force, or let's say before we escalate to military force. So those, that's targeted propaganda, that's, economic coercion, diplomatic coercion, financial sanctions, that comes in the form of, let's say, offering the Viktor Yanukovych regime, a $15 billion buyout of Ukrainian sovereign debt. And let's say that comes in the form of offering, preferred natural gas contracts. And all of those things are meant to slant the outcome. They are absolutely not above bribing members of parliament. Let's say like the Ukrainian parliament or, whichever country you pick, in order to try to destabilize the legislative process that sits beneath the prime minister of any of these countries or president of any of these countries. And that's how they try to, slant these things in their favor. When those mechanisms don't achieve the desired political end state, the Russians move forward into, actual, let's say, tactical maneuver, using their intelligence services and the elite units within the Russian Ministry of Defense. So the first thing to keep in mind is this is the much vaunted Spetsnaz that we've been taught were the boogeymen during the Cold Wars. And the Spetsnaz brigades are actually strategic reconnaissance assets for each of the Russian military districts. And they look a little bit more like Marine recon or Marine Force recon in the grand scheme of things. Their job is to actually first and foremost deliver information, but they are also regarded as elite trigger pullers in the Russian domain. But that's not their first job. That would be the VDV, the Russian airborne infantry. They're actually regarded as like Russia's most elite warfighters and trigger pullers. And they actually have their own Spetsnaz brigade. It's called the 45th SRB, Special Reconnaissance Brigade. But these are the kind of units that they surge in to start laying the framework. The term we would use in the West is operational preparation of the environment. And that's all the pre-day zero activities that would lay the framework for a successful military intervention. And then post D-Day, or let's say, day zero, activities, that would be advanced force operations. Those are all the activities that they rush in to conduct in order to lay the foundation for the entry of heavy Russian ground forces. So they operate under three principles: Maskirovka, which is simply Russian for camouflage. And what that means is they would prefer to operate through a hidden hand. This insulates them from international backlash. Let's say the Germans for years have held an enormous amount of leverage over Russia because they buy so much Russian oil and gas. And the only thing that would have made Moscow blink in any of these interventions or committing to them is if the Russians threatened to renege on their oil and gas contracts. Now, that would create an economic crisis for Germany, but that there's an enormous amount of money that Moscow would lose. That's about 40% of government revenues come from oil and gas itself. So that's not something that they can blink about. And so using the hidden hand approach gives them a plausible deniability, and it allows countries like Germany, for example, to say, hey, look, we don't like this. We don't like what's happening, but, the smoking gun it's not clear enough that, we can, induce an economic crisis, in order to confront them about this behavior. The second term is aktivnost, which is just Russian for activity. And those are all of the below boiling point activities that the Russians conduct in order to prevent the target nation's institutions from frustrating their military intervention. That would be, bribing or threatening politicians, letting the local police chief know that you have photos of him in an affair that he's having. That would be using, let's say, proxy forces like the Russian Night Wolves biker gang to go set up barricades. That would be facilitating, protests outside the local city hall or the local police station, so that they can't respond acutely to Russian kinetic activity. And then the last term is vnyezhnost. And vnyezhnost literally just means surprise, and what surprise refers to is the speedy employment of Russia's larger combat formations, particularly the VDV, but also, the Spetsnaz brigades to the extent that they can mobilize, sufficient firepower. They enumerate a number of key objectives that they would need to seize. And then once they can use limited kinetic force to keep the host nation government from securing those objectives, they then themselves would, surge, let's say, the VDV in the country in order to seize those objectives themselves and entrench their gains. And once a couple of battalions from the VDV are in place, the only way to unseat them is with large-scale artillery exchanges. And that's an escalation that in many cases, a target nation might not be willing to cross, especially if they're in a state of political turmoil. So that, in a nutshell, is hybrid warfare.
All right. So in the case of Ukraine, would you say, did it work? I mean, I think in Crimea, it can be considered a success, and the Donbass. But the second invasion, or do we have to wait till a cease of hostilities to see if the hybrid warfare tactics have worked?
Great question. The short answer is it did work in Ukraine for quite a number of years. From the moment Ukraine became independent, from the Soviet Socialist Republic as Ukraine reestablished its own constitutional governance in, I think we could say, 1992. The Russians have been very careful to recognize Ukrainian autonomy while at the same time undermining it under the rug, or behind closed doors. And they've done a very good job of making sure that there was always a kleptocratic regime that was pro-Moscow functioning in Kiev. And that really does follow the hybrid warfare framework, pretty neatly. Viktor Yanukovych became extremely unpopular, and when he, in his first campaign in 2004, when he failed, they got very nervous, and they made sure that in 2010 he would win. They really stacked the deck for his victory in 2010, and leading up to the Euromaidan crisis, Yanukovych became extremely unpopular, especially in his heavy-handed approach to cracking down on those protests. And he fled the country in February of 2014. He lost his nerve, and he eventually wound up in Moscow. And the Russians eventually tried to get him to set up, a government in exile. And that was when he started losing his nerve. That's when they started formulating how they were going to conduct the Crimean annexation. And if hybrid warfare had a Woodstock, it was the Crimean annexation. It was executed perfectly. the elite units that participated in it conducted themselves very professionally, and it was largely bloodless. So they did very well. The war in Donbass, which I analyze in my book, is another hybrid war in Ukraine that's separate and distinctive from the Crimean annexation. Started out in spring of 2014 as a let's say an insurgency. You could almost call it an unconventional war taken from the American lexicon. And the problem, they didn't enumerate their objectives clearly enough. They failed in their Vinyezepnost approach in actually maneuvering credible conventional forces to seize those objectives. And part of that was because Moscow was so intent on maintaining a hidden hand. They wanted Donetsk, Luhansk, and some of the other city centers in Donbass to become a similar autonomous republics to like South Ossetia or Abkhazia or maybe Transnistria, Moldova. And the Ukrainians were having none of it. The propaganda narrative that the Russians were pushing after the Crimean annexation had become entirely implausible, and no one believed that this was some sort of an indigenous grassroots movement to create political autonomy in Donbass. And so it took the summer of 2014 for the Ukrainian army to be reorganized and to start moving against some of these insurgencies with credible kinetic force. But once they did, the insurgents didn't really have the Russians, when they stand up proxy forces, they almost always follow the structure of a Russian conventional infantry or artillery battalion. And unfortunately, Mao was the one that figured this out, is that guerrillas won't stand and fight like regular soldiers. They don't have the unit cohesion and the culture of shared hardship that uniformed soldiers do. And so you have to let them function as guerrillas. You can't let them, you can't organize them as you would a conventional unit. And so they collapsed relatively quickly. And the Russians from August of 2014 forward had to surge their own conventional ground forces into Ukraine to shore up that collapsing insurgency. And what we saw that happen in Donbass when they did that is effectively they failed at executing a hybrid war in Donbass. And then they had to escalate into a full-scale conventional war that has a lot of the same hallmarks that the current war in Ukraine has at present. The entrenchments, the armored formations, the field of landmines, and they slowly pushed the Ukrainian forces out of Donetsk and Luhansk from the point where the insurgencies themselves were about to collapse. And by March of 2015, they had established a new status quo, and they had achieved, I think, the battle line that would serve as the status quo until their full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And so in that regard, that was a failed hybrid war. And what we're seeing in Ukraine at present is they attempted a hybrid war, but it suffered from a number of issues. And this is all actually in the epilogue of my book. They tried the Maskirovka, they tried to create the propaganda narrative, but they failed. No one in Ukraine is buying what they're selling anymore. They've interfered in Ukrainian affairs too many times. They tried actually to even build a propaganda narrative for the world about their intervention. They did this false flag operation where they tried to create a video. They actually took bodies from a morgue and they laid them out in a fashion that made it look like there had been some sort of ethnic cleansing of Russians in this area of Ukraine. And because of that, they needed to rush in and defend ethnically Russian individuals that were being persecuted by this terrible government in Kiev. And that when that was pushed out on social media, it fell apart within minutes. Like no one believed that was real in any sense. They tried the economic coercion. They tried the nuclear saber rattling with NATO. They started building up forces. They do these annual exercises they call Zapad and Vostok, and they conducted one of them. And from those exercises in September, they basically used that as their their surge point, or let's say their entry point to start pushing forces around the borders of Ukraine. Following the Lukashenko's sham re-elections in Belarus, he needed Moscow's support in order to stay in power, and the price of his continued reign in Belarus was the green light for Russia to stage, ground forces in Belarus. And so they occupied the northern Ukrainian border from Belarus, as well as, the Donbas region, and then Crimea and the south. And that started out as something like 40,000 soldiers total, which surged up to 80,000, which surged up to 120,000. And by their full buildup, they had about 200,000 troops, which at the time was the full expeditionary potential of the Russian armed forces. And I think the world was trying to decide, whether or not we should take this seriously. And I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin himself was convinced as to whether or not he should give the green light for this intervention. He was operating on some very bad information. We know now in the aftermath that the GRU was removed from the planning cycle in this. This was given to the FSB. So the GRU is Russia's military intelligence service. They work directly for the general staff. The FSB is the inheritor of the KGB, and it's Russia's largest intelligence service. It's also an institution that's kind of at war with itself, and it's very much at war with the other services, the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Defense. It's always trying to push its people into other institutions and gain leverage over them. It's a very kleptocratic place. The GRU, on the other hand, is Russia's, let's say, its most capable intelligence service by a large margin. If you're willing to, it'd be worth talking maybe a little bit about the mechanics of how the GRU actually works and why it wasn't in policymaking. The GRU is, it's first off, it's the institution that actually has operational control of all of Russia's Spetsnaz brigades. So they belong as assets to the military districts. But the GRU actually has command and control functionality over them. So they govern most of Russia's elite forces by volume. The other piece is that they are a spy agency, and as far as let's say intelligence operatives abroad, and then let's say the agents that they actually recruit and help collect information for them, they actually run about 6 times more agents abroad than the SVR, which is Russia's foreign intelligence service. That would be Russia's MI6, so to speak. But most of the GRU operatives were former Spetsnaz men. And because they use the Spetsnaz as a breeding ground for those agents, and they learn a number of good skills to have. Let's say they learn tactics, they learn field craft, they learn how to handle explosives and all sorts of things. But it creates a problem for the GRU as an institution because they do not have an appreciation of the delicacy of international relationships or the sensitivities of Moscow's position in global politics, and they can create incidents. And when they're not allowed to bring information directly to the Kremlin. The FSB is, and the SVR are, but the GRU works for the general staff. And so to get noticed, very often they go fishing, and they try to, knowing that military bureaucracy is a zero-sum game, they will try to do things to get noticed, to just remind the Kremlin that they're doing good things for Russia. So the assassination of Sergei Skripal was one of those occasions. You probably remember this. I believe it was, early summer of 2018. Sergei Skripal was a former Russian intelligence officer that had been flipped, and he was now living in the United Kingdom in Salisbury. These 2 GRU officers flew to the UK. They landed at London Heathrow, took a metro out to Salisbury, a cab out to his neighborhood, reconned his front door. Then they went back to their hotel in London, and then they came back the next day to Salisbury, sprayed something on his door, dropped it in a trash can, and then they were back on a train and at London Heathrow, and then on an airplane and out of London within 6 hours total. It was so ham-fisted as to be laughable, but using Novichok nerve agent in a foreign country, with Russia's fingerprints all over it, created a diplomatic crisis. they exposed maybe 5 or 6 people to nerve agent. 2 of them died. Neither of the people that died were their actual targets. Sergei Skripal and his daughter both lived through the attack. Dawn Sturgis died. This poor woman, her husband her boyfriend found the bottle that they had brought this nerve agent, and he had brought it into the house because he was trying to figure out what this is. And when she came in and he wasn't home, she sprayed some of it on her wrist, thinking that it might be a perfume that he had bought for her. And so this poor woman just, anyway. MI5 revealed that it demonstrated how ham-fisted the GRU was in this, and it demonstrated impressive capabilities of MI5. They had these guys from the start. They knew they could actually trace these guys from their arrival at the FSB Counterterrorism Training Center, where they apparently did like a week of briefings and training and planning sessions. Then tracking them from that training center to the airport in Russia. They have them getting off the plane at London Heathrow. They knew which flights they were on. They had the whole thing, and they laid it out for a British court. The Russians, it was so obvious. These 2 guys flew on false passports. The Brits had their real identities. One of them actually was, he had been awarded the Hero of the Russian Federation Award, which is like their Congressional Medal of Honor. The GRU, when they plan missions, the only thing they think of is, what is the end state that I'm trying to achieve? What's the tool I'm going to use? And how much leverage do I need in order to force that tool to get to that, to pry that tool to get to that end state that I need to achieve? And that's it. That's the only thinking that they go through. And that's a function of where they get their people from. After that incident, I think it was in a show of solidarity with the UK, 150 career Russian diplomats were expelled from embassies persona non grata across Europe. I think another 50 from the United States followed. And those individuals, most of them, they were probably called diplomats, but they were probably career Russian intelligence officers. The collective loss of intelligence for the Russians from that little incident was more than the Kremlin could bear. And his name was Igor Korobov. I think it was Colonel General Igor Korobov was the head of the GRU at the time, and he was summoned to the Kremlin for an intense dressing down, and then he died of stress in his house maybe a month later, sometime around October or November that year. I've never known whether the stress was, from getting tied to a chair and pushed into a lake or what it was, but no one seems to lament him being gone. Anyway, after this incident, the GRU was removed. No one cared what they thought. No one wanted them to participate in anything. And the FSB, when they claimed primacy over planning for Ukraine, I don't think the GRU was in a position to resist. The GRU had planned the Russo-Georgian War, the Crimean annexation, the war in Donbass. That was their job, is to plan these things out for the Russian general staff and to bring them the information that they would need to assist in military planning. Instead, it was handed off to FSB. The FSB 5th Directorate is the directorate that is responsible for running foreign agents and then bringing that information back. They're supposed to run them in a counterintelligence capacity, but I think it's more likely that they just run foreign agents and there's less focus on counterintelligence and more focus on just gathering information, as needed, so to speak. There's not a whole lot of infrastructure there to police their behavior. And the 5th director is supposed to run those agents, bring that information back, analyze it and process it into real intelligence, and then deliver that information to the Kremlin as part of the presidential daily brief. That was most likely the directorate that was given the lion's share of the policy planning, let's say, for the Ukrainian intervention, the special military operation in February of 2022. The director, it took 2 weeks following the invasion in February 24th, for the President Putin to place the director of the 5th Directorate under arrest, which means it took him about 2 weeks to realize he'd been lied to. We know now, based on the charges that were leveled against him, that he was probably enriching himself out of his own covert operations budget. He was telling the Kremlin that Ukraine is overwhelmingly pro-Russian, that the government in Kiev was weak, that the government in Kiev is being run by Western powers primarily, and it's not making its own decisions in any way. And these are all things that Moscow wanted to hear. And they were told that the campaign to take Ukraine is the size of Alaska, but the campaign to take Ukraine would only last maybe 10 days. And after that, they expected all resistance to cease. And this is utter nonsense. The campaign to seize Crimea didn't even take 10 days. So the next piece of this that absolutely caused this train to come off the rails was Moscow's appalling information security. First off, the leaks coming out of the Russian government, they have more leaks than the Iranian Navy. It's very bad, but there's more to it than that. They decided, in order to make sure that no one knew what they were going to do, they weren't going to communicate with their soldiers or their officers and all the ground force commanders at all. So it's unclear when the general staff were told to start planning for this, but what is clear is the general staff seemed to plan for a 10-day campaign, and they were sent to theater in the first place and told that you need to plan for field exercises. We're going to demonstrate Russian military power. We're going to saber rattle for a while. And that's what they planned for. That's what they stockpiled ammunition for and fuel for. They didn't really stockpile even sufficient quantities of donated blood to deal with all the combat casualties they were going to receive. And that's most likely because the general staff was told to plan for exercises and then a 10-day campaign. We don't really know when the general staff was told that we are going to actually invade, but we do know that there are hundreds of Russian paratroopers who were captured by Ukrainian forces in the early days. The VDV, a lot of their units were sent, and the GRU Spetsnaz were sent to try to capture Kiev. And we know now, after a lot of them have been captured, that they didn't even know they were going to war until they were boarding aircraft with parachutes, and they were told that, hey, this isn't a training drop, you're going to get dropped into war. And that beggars the imagination. How could you get all the soldiers to plan on how they're going to capture X, Y, and Z objectives, and how could they credibly maneuver to capture those objectives if they didn't know until they were getting on the aircraft that they were getting into a fight? To give you just a point of comparison, in the early days of the planning for D-Day leading up to the massive June 6, 1944 invasion of Normandy in World War II, all of the airborne infantry were given sand tables for months to memorize while the United States and the Brits built up forces in southern England for that invasion. And they were all told, this is you're going to be capturing Caen, or you're going to be capturing St. Mary-Gleaves. These are where you're going to hit. If you miss your drop zone, I want you to memorize this region up here, the sand tables for this region down here, so that you know how to get to your objectives. And that's that's how you successfully plan for a military operation. The Russians didn't engage in any of that, and they just thought Ukraine would collapse. And the only explanation as to why they thought they could get away with that is because the FSB didn't know what information the GRU needed in order to plan this thing, or the FSB didn't know what information the general staff needed to plan this thing. The general staff was too weak and incompetent to tell the Kremlin it needed a decision, and they didn't have the means to tell the FSB that you're not delivering us the information we need. And so everybody operated on partial information and was not willing to stand up to any other part of this ecosystem and say, hey, look, we don't have any of the pieces to do this. It beggars the imagination. It also draws into contrast, the scope and scale of what it is that they were trying to do. With the Crimean annexation, or even the war in Syria, the Russians were strictly using elite forces and the best officers that the ground forces have. These are only the top-notch commanders that are being put into combat situations, and they're maneuvering the creme de la creme of troops. In order for Russia to muster 200,000 soldiers, they had to go to every backwater installation that they have and basically empty the garrison out and say, hey, look, like all of you are going to war. And the there's some complexities in Russian law where only contract soldiers can be sent to war outside of Russia's borders unless there's a larger declaration of war, made, as was the case, let's say, in World War II. And so that's who these 200,000 soldiers that got thrown into the meat grinder were. They were Russia's contract soldiers, the most motivated and well-trained of their soldiery. And what they've had to do now is run a general conscription and to try to refill the ranks of all those units that have been destroyed. And it's not going well. They have 3 times the larger force now than they did then. I think they're running a little over 600,000 troops in theater now. But they're not trying a war of maneuver. They're doing trench warfare. So that follows the model. When hybrid warfare breaks down, it devolves into brutal conventional slogging match, effectively.
Fascinating. I remember seeing a visual of, I think it's the equivalent of Zillow, the house selling website that you guys have in the US, where you can sell your house.
Yeah.
They showed the Crimean Peninsula, and then they identified all the FSB officers' houses up for sale in in Crimea, and that was fascinating to see because it was all beachfront, and so they knew.
Yeah,
they
knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, so that was it's mind-boggling that can happen at that scale.
Or the number of yachts of Russian oligarchs that ended up in Turkey somehow.
Yeah, yeah, another one. So what's next for Russian hybrid warfare, do you think?
I think it will continue to be the governing modus operandi for many years to come. The approach is born out of a Russian grand strategy that's 400 years old. The problem is that to annex something to conduct something as sophisticated as the Crimean annexation, you actually do need elite forces, and Russia has thrown almost all of its elite units into the meat grinder. The 45th SRB, which is the Spetsnaz brigade for the VDV, took so many combat casualties that there were updates in open source media that indicated it might have one combat effective company out of the entire brigade. And those are not people that can be easily replaced. That is years of development and training in order to build an officer cadre around those individuals. And you can't just decide that you can't just decide that you're going to fill those ranks with conscripts and it's going to perform at the same level. And that goes with all of the other Spetsnaz brigades or the Russian naval infantry. Which are considered the Russian naval. They don't call them Marines; they call them naval infantry. Morskoye Pehota, or Morskaya Pehota is their term, which literally means Navy infantry. And then they have the VDV, and the naval infantry and the VDV they share officers. They do a lot of common training. They don't conceptualize Marines in the same way we do. Marines mostly do airborne operations and air assault in Russia, and those units have been utterly hollowed out of their pre-war combat potential. Moscow's working hard to replace all their combat losses with conscripts, but that's it's a band-aid on a broken leg. The reason, if those units had any of their pre-war combat capability, they probably wouldn't be running slow-moving artillery bombardments and slowly moving the ball forward in the trenches. They would be trying a war of maneuver, and they just don't have it in them. They haven't shown an ability to conduct joint operations at all. The aerospace forces, the VKS, they came a long way in Syria. That Syria was a constant process of honing their TTPs, training their officers, and refining the kind of ordnance that they were going to use to conduct strikes. And that was a good training ground for them. But they've revealed that they're nowhere near the capability of a Western or NATO air force, and they certainly can't coordinate. They can't coordinate with ground forces at scale. But it's worse than that. The Russians have revealed that they can't actually even conduct combined arms maneuver. So this slow rolling steamroller approach from World War I is pretty much the only thing that they have available to them. And so to conduct this chic and sophisticated intervention like Crimea is no longer in their capacity. That does not mean that all the tools will go away. The non-military influence activities, whether that's financial or economic coercion or anything else, that will absolutely stay. They will still use organizations like Wagner, especially in the third world, to try to let's say send dividends back to Moscow and establish client states that will vote with Moscow at the UN. But hybrid warfare, in the sense that we've known it, they just don't have the capacity to do. But they have all of the strategic incentives to try to execute it, and it will remain at the strategic and operational levels, but not at the tactical level.
Do you think that the Russian model can be replicated, or especially on tactical level, or exported, as it were? And the reason why I ask is looking at Serbia, what the influence of Serbia is trying to affect on Bosnia and the Serbian enclave there, Republika Srpska and Kosovo, where they have put little green men, as it were, into North Kosovo. Is that an extension of the Russian hybrid war, or is it Serbia recreating or copying these techniques?
Ooh, man, it's a bit of a complex question. Interesting question. I don't think we can say that it is Serbia really trying to copy Russian hybrid war. The Russians themselves don't even have a word for what it is that they do. When they say hybrid war, what they're talking about is Western influence operations. They don't even call it hybrid war in their own terminology. So it's definitely not something they've taught to the Serbians. Without getting too deep into the specifics, I would say that what the Serbians are doing is, let's say they're imitating some best practices that they've seen at the tactical level, but it doesn't have the same coordinated targeted propaganda, and they don't have the means of financial coercion or diplomatic coercion, these non-military, non-kinetic influences that the Russians are so good at deploying. And they don't have near the economic heft, let's say, that Russia does. Russia is not a very big economy. It's actually it's a little bit smaller than the economy of Texas, just for scale. But it is a massive exporter of oil and gas, and it's the world's largest wheat exporter. And it's also the world's largest fertilizer exporter, both in potash and nitrogen-based fertilizers. And because of that, it's very, very difficult to carve them out of the world economy without creating an energy crisis and global famine. Serbia has none of those tools, and I could definitely, especially with the cultural connections that they have to Russia, I could see them trying to implement some of the practices of the Spetsnaz and maybe the secret police. But the larger framework of hybrid warfare, I think, is outside their grasp. I could see the Iranians doing it. The IRGC and especially Quds Force, or Al-Quds, depending on what you're going to call it, they're a remarkably sophisticated institution that kind of straddles the shed between intelligence as let's say an intelligence service and a special operations syndicate. And they absolutely have it within their ability to conduct hybrid warfare in a place like Iraq. They have an enormous amount of economic leverage over Iraq because Iraq imports much of their electricity from Iran. And then they have an enormous number of Shiite politicians in Iraq that rely on Iranian patronage. And Iran has a vested interest in making sure that remains a dominant coalition as opposed to, let's say the Sunnis, especially the Sunnis in a place like Anbar. And they have, I would say that they have the strategic impetus, they have the means operationally for the non-kinetic influences, and then at the tactical level, they have the very sophisticated institution in Quds Force and the IRGC that would be capable of executing.
Do you think in strategic or even tactical discourse in the world that we underestimate the Iranians?
I think we underestimate them, and I think we overestimate them. Let me explain the underestimation first. The whole thesis of the Ayatollah, and we kind of tend to forget that Iran it's a theocratic oligarchy. And let's say if the Ayatollah were to die tomorrow from old age, there are another 50 senior clerics who can take his office and occupy the office of the supreme leader. It's also absolutely the case that even if those individuals weren't there and they didn't have the cultural and, let's say, theological support to gain that level of political influence, that the IRGC as a separate institution would be capable of running Iran as a military dictatorship. The elected government, and I use that in a loose sense, doesn't really have it. It has the authority to do things within a very, very limited bandwidth, and that's it. And for Iran to join the world order as a legitimate actor, let's say a legitimate actor as a trading country and a commerce partner, without their capacity, and for them to forego this need to project influence in the world through insurgency, and they're sponsoring insurgencies, and the Houthis in Yemen, Lebanon, they're doing it in Iraq. They've done it in Syria. They're the principal supporters of Hamas, although they treat them. Hamas for them they're Sunni, and they're treated as apostates. But if it achieves your goals, why not use apostates as cannon fodder? And for them to forego doing those things, by definition, means that the Iranian Revolution failed. And so, from a philosophical and a theological sense, it's not something that they will ever be able to recognize as long as their governing institutions are clinging to the dogma of the Iranian Revolution as sponsored by the Ayatollah. So in keeping with that kind of grand strategy, if you look at, let's say, what the IRGC has been able to set up with Hezbollah is an alarmingly sophisticated non-state, I guess you could call it an international terrorist organization, but the better term might be regional militia, an alarmingly sophisticated regional militia. If you give them another 15 years, 20 years working with the Houthis will be at the same point. If you look at their operations in Latin America, they discovered they work hand in hand with Hezbollah to do money laundering operations. They've realized that Venezuela, as a near failed state, needs whatever help it can get, and they're willing to work with anybody to get that help. And so they're willing to help the Venezuelan government move narcotics northward into the United States or Europe, and then they're willing to help Hezbollah set up those money laundering services from those narcotic revenues, and that helps fund some of their covert operations abroad. There are an alarming number of IRGC and Quds Force operatives in South America, and not just in Venezuela. They're active in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and they can do some real things, and they are not afraid to pull triggers when they think their national interests are at stake. On the inverse, whenever we get into a confrontation, when Western governments get into a confrontation with the Iranians, there are a number of media pundits that come forward, and they hand wring about the potential for a World War III from the confrontation. And this is utter nonsense. The Iranian armed forces are, let's say, they're much more competent than the Saudis, for sure, but they're underfunded. They're using antiquated, absolutely broken military hardware. They have no capacity to really project power outside of Persia because they're hemmed in by mountain ranges, and so supporting the logistics trains for anything that would, for conventional military forces in a place like Iraq, is near impossible for them. They have no navy, beside a number of small, fast boats that can do coastal patrols. And their armed forces, the term they use for it is the Artesh. The idea that they can stand up to a single carrier battle group is absurd in the extreme. That doesn't mean that we want to go to a war with Iran. in any sense. And that does not mean that we ever want to get into a war of occupation and have to, put soldiers into a place like Tehran and try to build new Iranian institutions. But yeah, their capacity to really project conventional military power is almost zero. They're an incompetent, backwater, underfunded, extremely corrupt country. And their capacity to invade their neighbors is very low. So we overestimate them and we underestimate them.
Understood. We can talk about this for a long time. I wanted to ask you, because I know you cannot really talk about what you do right today, but if somebody's listening to the podcast and they're either interested in joining special forces, or they want to write a book, or they want to follow somewhat in your footsteps, as it were, what advice would you give them?
Well, I guess the first thing to say, and when I talk to young people, when I tell them look, it's not a bad thing to plan your life out. Figure out where you want to be when you're 40 years old or 50 years old, and then start plotting a pathway to get there. And that goes for men and women, and I've always known that I wanted a family and I wanted a wife and kids. And you have to make those things a priority in order to get to that end state. And the inverse is true for ladies too. The other piece I would say, if you're interested in going to special forces, or the Navy's going to have the SEALs, or the Marines have their own elite units, or whatever it is. Maybe you want to join the French Fourth Legion. I know a few people that have. I know a few Americans that have, actually. If you want to do those things, you can. The first thing you have to do is tell yourself is that those things are within reach and that you have the capacity to do them. And then you have to start plotting how you're going to get there. When Navy SEALs aren't born, they're built. And you have to start the process of building that individual. Part of it means adopting a very long-term outlook. You have to understand that the pain you're in the moment, or being the cold, or being hungry, or whatever it is, these things all pass, and they're not as important as the objective you set for yourself. And it's easy to say that when you're warm in your living room, and I'm going to adopt that mentality, but you have to maintain that mentality when you're actually cold and when you're actually wet and suffering. The second thing I would say is, once you've made your plan and you know what you're going to do and where you're going to go, you need to get to the gym, and you need to start running, and you need to start working out. You need to come up, and you're not trying to build a beach body. You're trying to create functional fitness, the kind of functional fitness that will keep you in the game. And the more physically fit you are, the better it is to keep your mind in the game of what it is that you're doing. I would say serving Special Forces really opened up some wonderful career doors for me. And it's a great career for anybody that wants to go into it, but it's also a great door opener, and it's embrace the opportunities. I would tell them to find some academic challenges and get away from the need to necessarily do a conventional degree. People with bachelor's degrees, the one thing they all have in common is that we can't really tell that they have a bachelor's degree unless they tell you. That's kind of what's happened, is there's so many of them out there, but we can tell, but employers can tell the difference between somebody who's served in the 82nd Airborne or the Marine Corps and somebody off the street, and they will choose that person over somebody that has a bachelor's degree any day of the week, because they know that person has discipline, they know how to get on board with the mission, and they know how to be part of a team. And as far as so that's what I would tell you is it's an opportunity for you to have the adventure of your life. And if you will embrace it that way and understand that it gets you to where you want to be when you're 40 or 50, then you have an opportunity to do something really special. As far as writing a book goes, I can tell you that the core thing is for you to be very interested in the project, for you to love what it is that you're doing. I would take time to find the right, whether it's a fiction or a nonfiction thing. For me, I almost don't exclusively read nonfiction. I don't know. You can probably tell I'm a little bit of a nerd.
Well, very much alike. So,
yeah, yeah. That's all right. I'll be guilty with you.
Yeah.
I would tell you that once you find something that you're passionate about, it doesn't need to be on a timeline. Start doing the research, start doing the reading, start building a pile of materials that you're going to need, and take the time and slowly walk it forward and see what it turns into. Yeah. And the other thing I'll tell you is if you're going to publish, you need to make sure that you start finding a publisher before you've written the full manuscript. You need to find somebody once you've written like a couple of chapters or you have a good outline. Finding them after you've written the full manuscript is difficult because it may not fit into their business strategy. Learn a foreign language.
It's a big one.
I would tell, this is a bigger problem in America than it is in your part of the world. But I would tell Americans that you need to learn a foreign language. And we have this kind of hubris that everybody should speak English. We're very lucky that English is kind of the global business language, but it reduces your functionality, and it's just learning the language itself helps you kind of understand how other parts of the world function, and it gets you out of your, let's say, your own egocentric universe.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is one actually that's probably something that comes up every episode. Learn a foreign language, so it says a lot. So, do you have any questions for me, Curtis?
I tell you what, I said at the beginning, and I'll say it again. I read a lot of great dynamics. I love some of the content that you guys push out. And I guess one of my questions would be, how do you guys find which topics you're going to be publishing on in the next week? So like I was reading one on this L3 vampire system last night. Yeah. And I was like, man, my truck needs that surface-to-air missile. And I was just like, how do you find these things? And like, what is it, how do you bring this stuff forward?
So that's a great question. I think when we started out doing the publication, it was more of, I think, the mission statement of how we pick topics was what I find cool. That's how it started, basically. And to give analysts autonomy and showcase their own interest, the way we work is we give them the topics pretty much in the beginning of joining us, and they build up an understanding of the culture and the focus of what Great Dynamics is and what we focus on. And I think if you had to put it into an umbrella term, something you know really well, is topics focused around irregular warfare, I would say. And that's also problems and topics that we cover with clients offline. So that's one. And I think today we're a little bit more sophisticated and have a bit more gray hair. I think today we don't really follow news and trends. It happens so to be that if you do forecasts, your stuff will come into the news eventually. So it's a little bit being ahead of the curve, but not for the sake of being ahead of the curve. Just understanding problems in the world and knowing that, yeah, maybe most people are not interested in what you're writing about, but they will come around. So today we published something on Myanmar, and there's a whole insurgency going on there where the government is, I think, only 50% of the land they have in hand. But you're not hearing it in the news because the news is dominated by what's happening in Gaza and in the Red Sea. And then there's other places like Sudan and the Sahel. And so we look at where are the hotspots, for a lack of a better word, in the world, and what are the topics or indicators that drive those hotspots. So it might be organized crime, it might be narcotics, it might be terrorism, it might be foreign influence. So, and that's how the topics are born. So that's kind of in a convoluted way giving you an answer. I hope that gave an answer.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And I think one of the things I love most about Great Dynamics is, I was telling you this, I think on Friday, but you guys draw my attention to, little insurgencies that are happening in unlikely parts of the world that are just not on the radar within the general public discourse. And, there's this section of the FARC that's active in doing some things, and we should be aware of them. And here's a forecast about what we think is going to happen in that region for the next 6 or 12 months. And, here's a soft unit that most people weren't particularly aware of, and they're doing good work in this section of the Philippines or, whatever it is, right? And I think that's an enormously valuable thing about Great Dynamics that I use to kind of inform myself about a lot of things that are off the radar of the mainstream media.
Cheers. I think what you just said there is what I want to hear from somebody who reads or engages with our material. So that's, if we were able to do that, then we did a great job. And it also helps young analysts find their way of, how do I collect information? How do I process that, turn that into intelligence products? And so that's the end state for our writers, is that we want them to be able to write about something that they enjoy, but also create a product that informs as well as supports decision making if somebody wants to travel somewhere or want to do business in a country. So it's a bit of an extension of what we do offline, and now we do it with great pride, and we're working on some really cool projects in the next couple of months. I'm really excited for you to see that, and for the rest of the people listening. My last question, Curtis, is outside of your book, which we will put in the description of everything on our website. What are you reading at the moment, or listening to, or watching?
So, in the moment, right now, what's sitting on my nightstand is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky.
Wow.
And that's
a thick bill.
That's a thick book. I'm not sure I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. The book I just finished that I would tell everybody in the U.S. military, especially to read, is called The Generals. It was written by Tom Ricks, and it's an outline in the first chapters about George C. Marshall and the system of management that he set up during World War II, and how it is that he picked the generals that were going to fight and win World War II. It talks about how he set grand strategy with cooperation from Henry Stenson, who was the Secretary of War, for the Roosevelt administration. It talks about how he set up civil military discourse with the Roosevelt administration. And then it talks about how civil military discourse broke down the moment that he left his role as Army Chief of Staff, and the Roosevelt administration gave way to Truman, and the problems that the Army Officer Corps faced in Korea, the general breakdown, the inability to understand the battlefield by General Westmoreland in Vietnam, and the reforms that the Army made after Vietnam, both by Creighton Abrams and then by William Dupuy, to build the Army that we know in the United States today. And he goes into the generals that actually started the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Tommy Franks, and then Ricardo Sanchez in Iraq. And he goes into how they repeated mistakes that were essentially made, in Vietnam. A failure to understand the conflict that they were in, and an inability to pivot strategy based on the information they were receiving from subordinate officers. He points out some luminary instances of leadership, like, let's say, Marine General O.P. Smith in Korea, who I think has set the standard for what a division commander should be, and the standard against which all division commanders should be evaluated against. He identifies, the innovative nature of David Petraeus, and he highlights the differences between David Petraeus's management of the 101st Airborne and running the battlefield around Mosul, as opposed to other segments of Iraq that were under different kinds of management, and how successful he was in comparison, even at division command. And he talks about General Mattis, and General Mattis's leadership in Iraq. And it's not just critique; it's also examples to follow. And he does have some prognostications about how to make sure that we don't repeat history in the next conflict. And I couple that, if there's one biography of George C. Marshall I could recommend, it would be Defender of the Republic. And that is a very good book for understanding what it is to be a statesman and the high-mindedness that comes with a lifetime of service.
I've written them down, so I'm gonna definitely check them out and add them also to the reading list. Curtis, this is the longest podcast I've ever done. I also think this is the podcast that I've said the least, because it was really fascinating to hear you talk. I didn't want to interrupt. There was really no reason for me to interrupt, because your explanations were extremely detailed and complete. And I really want to, again, thank you for you come on and share with us your story and your research and your book. And I think for everybody listening, please, guys, get Hybrid Warfare, the Russian Approach to Strategic Competition and Conventional Military Conflict. It's available everywhere. And I've ordered it. I haven't been able to read it all yet, but I got into it. And it's an incredibly important book if you want to understand Russian strategy, operations, as well as tactical level activities. And please, guys, go get it.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for the opportunity. It's been great. And as I said, I'm a big fan and I love the product you guys are putting out.
Cheers. Thank you. Everybody listening, guys, if you made it this far, as I say every week, please give us some feedback and some critique so we can improve on what we're doing. Thank you, and see you guys the next time.